Hello, hello, my friends. AmyR here with Prairie Paper and Ink. Welcome back to my face and my card making space and some cards that are part of my black, white, and gold series. For those that might be newer, I have a thing for gold, black, and white color combo. It's just classic, and I love it. Yeah. So I have an entire playlist. There's tons of videos. I'm not even sure how many because it's been a while since I've done one. But I will have a link to that playlist at the end of this video so you can check it out. There are just tons. All different occasions and styles and things like that. But the running theme is black, gold, and white. So I made some cards using the Simon Says Stamp September 2023 card kit. I've already done a video unboxing that kit, and I made a couple cards using the big stencil set in the kit, and I'll have that linked at the end of the video as well for those that didn't see it. And then yeah, this time I concentrated more on the stamp set. I used the embossing folder and a little bit of the pattern paper, which again, pat myself on the back because like I always tell you guys, I've always loved pattern paper. I used to use it constantly. Now I hoard it. But I used some of it this time. So yeah, really fun cards. And I went with a bit of a different color scheme. Instead of doing like warmer colors, you know, because it's sunflowers, etc. I did gold instead. And then black, white, and a bit of gray, which still applies because it just mixes things up a bit. So keep watching and I will show you guys how I made all these cards. So I ended up making 3 cards and I'm kind of all over the place as I'm making them. It's one of those things where it's like one thing led into another and too many ideas. Anyway, I started with some white cardstock and I put that into my MISTI and I'm stamping the first layer. There's a set of 3 images in the Be Happy set that comes in the kit. I will have links to everything that's individually available as well, which the set obviously is. And yeah, there's a 3-piece stamp that builds this little cluster of sunflowers. So I took the stamp that is the petals and lined it up on the white cardstock. I used my anti-static powder tool and then I inked up and stamped the image a couple times with clear embossing ink, and then I coated it with some Simon Says Stamp gold embossing powder and melted that with my heat tool. So once I've got that smooth and melted, I just set it aside and I'll come back to that later. Because I was like trying to do as much of the heat embossing all at once. So then I grabbed a piece of black cardstock and I wasn't 100% sure this one would work. This is like the big kind of solid bee emblem, really is what it is. And I wasn't sure because it's very, very detailed. And I was like, well, I'll stamp it. I'll add the embossed powder, melt it and see. Because sometimes when you do images like this and you go to melt the embossing powder, you just lose all the detail because it's just too much for even, and you know, fine detail embossed powder, like, or super fine sometimes works. It just depends on all the different things. But I melted it and it turned out perfect. And I was like, ooh, this is loving it. So then I grabbed a piece of A2 cardstock and I'm using the solid kind of honeycomb shape stamp, anti-static powder tool, and lined up the stamp, stamped it again with a couple times with clear embossing ink and again gold embossing powder. And it'll never get old. I've said this a million times. I love heat embossing, especially with metallic embossing powder. It's just like, ooh, look at the shiny as it melts. So I stamped it and then I just flipped the panel around to stamp it again. So I, you know, wasn't working on spacing everything perfectly. In the end, it's fine. But if you want to line all, you know, it up multiple times and like completely fill a background, don't do this. Because unless you get it like perfect. And you'll see as I line up to stamp it in other inks and stuff. But I was fine with that. I'm just, you know, just saying you gotta like position it each time if you want to do, you know, entire background, use different colors, etc. So I did that heat embossing first, and then I'm going to go in and do a couple different shades of gray inks just to kind of build out a bit of a pattern. So I'm using Simon Says Stamp Positively Saturated inks. The first one I think is Earl. It's behind my computer. Yes, Earl. So a medium gray shade. And then I'm also going to use Flannel. And this is where I started noticing, I was like, ooh, yeah, things aren't going to line up like exactly, you know? But that's fine. I was like, I'll just kind of build a sort of a pattern around it. Like, it's fine. So that's what I did. So I just started moving the panel around, lining up the stamp, just kind of wherever, you know, just to bring in those shapes and the different shades of, I've got the 2 shades of gray and then the gold heat embossing. So yeah, this was just me kind of fiddling around with it. And I've sped all of this up in editing because as usual, it was just kind of like, don't want it here. Whatever, you know? So just kind of kept fiddling with it till I was like happy with the placement, and then I'd go in and stamp, you know, and then flip it around, do the same thing with a different shade, etc. So my last little bit here, I did that Earl ink again. So just bringing in a little second section of that darker gray. And then my final little bit, I'm going to heat emboss one last time. So Positively Saturated inks, pretty much all inks, they take a little bit to dry. And I've just stamped that. So I still use my anti-static powder tool. However, that ink, that gray ink that I just stamped is definitely not dry. And I didn't realize I was off camera. But when I poured the embossing powder on, it stuck to all that like dark gray area that I got over. But that was fine because it's such a simple image. You know, it's like literal straight lines. I just used a dry brush and brushed off the spots where I didn't want the embossing powder to be. And it was good to go. And then I can melt it and go on about my day. And that's exactly what I did. So I melted it, and then I've got my background, and I set that aside. There is a coordinating die set for this stamp set. I do not have it. You could also trim this out with scissors. It's fine, but I don't like trying to, even attempting to do straight lines with my scissors. You just know. I've talked about this in the past. Like, as I've gotten older, I have astigmatism in both my eyes, and it just gets worse as I get older. So it's like, no, can't do that. So all I did though was just line up kind of the edges of that heat embossed image in my little guillotine trimmer here, and then just use that to trim it off. Because again, they're straight lines. So I'll let the trimmer do the work, and I ain't going to worry about it. So I trimmed that one down. And then what was left of this scrap of black cardstock, I decided to do the anti-static powder tool again. I lined up another one of the sentiments from the stamp set and the larger just bee image, and there's a little crown image too, which I just think is adorable. So I just kind of lined those up, straightened them out, and then I'm going to gold heat emboss those onto this little panel of black cardstock. So ink that up, stamped it a couple times with the clear embossing ink, coat it with the gold embossing powder, and then melt that with my heat tool. So my whole kind of reasoning, like doing all this, was I was trying to get all the heat embossing done so I can move this all out of the way. And then I end up still doing a little bit more heat embossing, so whatever. And I'm literally like mentally doing like 3 cards at once. So I was jumping like back and forth. So now I'm back to that first image that I gold heat embossed just the petals. So now I've got the centers, line that up, and that I'm going to stamp with black ink. And for that I used Concord and Ninth's black ink. And one thing to note with Concord and Ninth, and I've talked about this before, their inks are very, very similar to Simon's Positively Saturated inks. The ink pads and whatnot are the same. Whether or not the formulation is actually the same, I have no idea. But they're very similar. And I like kind of using them together interchangeably because there's just different colors between the 2 lines and they just complement each other. So anyway, the thing though to note, especially with the Concord Ninth, is they are incredibly juicy. You need to use the lightest hand, like the most gentle tapping on your stamps. Because I've had people contact me about that. And yeah, just like you just barely, like don't press at all, literally. So I stamped the centers with the black ink. The leaves, I used that same Earl ink, the Simon Positively Saturated. And then this is where I decided to do the heat embossing. So I stamped all that and then lined up another one of the sentiments from the set. This time it was pretty simple. It was far enough away from the other images that I didn't have to worry about getting embossing powder where I didn't want it. And I stamped the sentiment with clear embossing ink and then used that gold embossing powder. So I've got, I'm going to have 3 different kind of focuses for 3 different cards. And for the one where I had that emblem, I took just another piece of white cardstock, and I'm going to gold heat emboss another sentiment from the Be Happy stamp set. So anti-static powder tool, going to ink up the stamp it a couple times. I was realizing as I was doing these, I was like, I need to re-ink my clear embossing ink pad. Like, I use this thing so much that I do re-ink it. I say fairly regularly. I honestly can't even remember the last time I needed to, because it lasts forever, but I make a ton of cards and I use clear embossing ink all the time. After I was finished this video, I re-inked it. So anyway, stamped it a couple times and then used the gold embossing powder. And then I ended up die cutting it with one of Simon's nested domed arches wafer dies, which you'll see in a bit. And then for the background for that card, I took a piece of the glossy black cardstock that comes in the kit, and I cut it down to A2 sized, put it on my flour sackcloth, and sprayed the back of it with just a little bit of water. That just helps soften the fibers a bit. Just need a light little mist. And then, like I always do with Simon's embossing folders, I use my Spellbinders Platinum 6, the original platform, and I have 2 metal shims, and then the folder with the cardstock. And I mist the cardstock, like I said, just to soften the fibers. You get a deeper impression that way. I lay out my flour sackcloth when I do it, just so I don't get water everywhere, because you know what's going to happen. And then I'm using the Crisscross Floral embossing folder that also comes with the kit. And then I run that through my die cutting machine, and it impresses just, I really like this one. I've used it. I think I used it in another video. I can't even remember, you guys. It's just, things have been chaotic. But I loves it. And I love doing like metallic cardstocks and gloss cardstocks. It's an interesting look. But to even enhance that a little bit further, I use the little sanding disc that comes in the kit. You can get these separately, and I'll have links to them. They're the little Tim Holtz Distress sanding discs, and they attach to the handles of the blending tools. And I am not using any pressure. Like, I am barely just lightly running this over, because it's just sanding away all the raised edges and exposing the white cardstock underneath. So with one like this, you do not need like any pressure, any effort whatsoever. Other types of folders, other types of cardstock sometimes, or if you want to just get creative and you know, make a really like distressed, roughed up look, you can do that. But I found with this, I barely was touching the cardstock. So I did all that, and then I pulled out some black hemp from my stash. This used to be the thing, not the black hemp, specifically just regular like hemp cord. This was like it sounds ridiculous, but it's like, this was like the only embellishment we had back in the day. You know, when I first started card making over 2 decades ago, it's crazy to think it's been 2 decades, but it has been. You know, hemp cord, that was the thing. Before ribbon, before all the things, it was hemp cord, you know? So a little old school. Anyway, had this black stuff in my stash and decided to use that just to add a little embellishment to a couple of these panels. So I doubled up the cord for that panel, wrapped it around, used my reverse tweezers to help hold things in place so I could tie my little bow. And then on this one that I had gold heat embossed and then die cut with one of the little nested domed arches wafer dies, I just used a single length of the cord, and again, reverse tweezers, tie it in a bow, fiddle with it for a bit, because the reverse tweezers can just kind of hold it in place for me. And then I just fiddle with it till I'm happy with it. Once I'm happy with it, I can remove the tweezers, pull the bow tight, and then trim off the excess of the tails. So after I did that, then I'm going to pop that. That's just what I'm going to call it, as an emblem, because that's what it looks like. I really like the style of it too. Anyway, I'm going to pop that into place with some just thin foam squares. So it gives it a little bit of dimension, but not a whole lot of bulk. So put those little foam squares into place. And then on the backs of these panels, along with that other sentiment that I had heat embossed on the black cardstock, I'm going to put Simon's Big Mama foam tape on the back of all of these. Because again, it'll give it a little bit of dimension without a whole lot of bulk. So I put that on the back of this panel. I also trimmed down that black glossy cardstock that I had run through the embossing folder, I trimmed that down to smaller than an A2 card front. This one that I stamped that like honeycomb type background onto, I didn't trim down. It's full A2 size. And then I popped that sentiment into place on there. And then the floral one, I took a piece of the pattern paper from the kit. I first matted this piece with just a little bit of black cardstock. And then I'm going to adhere this to one of the pattern papers that I also, I die cut it with a rectangle wafer die. And that's also going to be slightly smaller than the card front, just so it gets framed nicely. And then this background that I had run through the embossing folder and sanded, I had trimmed down roughly like 4 inches by 5 1/4. Again, just slightly smaller than an A2 card front. Speaking of card fronts, for the card bases, I chose more sentiments from that same Be Happy set. And I've got my card bases, which are going to be top folding A2 white note cards. And for one of the cards, I just trimmed down just a little narrow strip of one of the pattern papers. I lined up one of the sentiments and I stamped that with Concord and Ninth Stardust ink. So stamp the sentiment with that, set that aside. The next one, I'm going to add the remaining strip of pattern paper that I used. So use that as kind of my guide first, and then stamped that sentiment with VersaFine Clair Nocturne ink. So got that stamped. And then on the final card on the inside, I'm going to stamp that honeycomb pattern with that same Stardust ink. So line that up, inked it up with the Stardust ink. Again, just very gentle taps. Very gentle. Because if you mush with these ink pads, it's just the ink is going to go absolutely everywhere. So just very light tapping. And these, that's where, you know, again, I don't know the formula of the things, but they act the same way as the Simon inks and they smooth out as they dry, similar to the Simon inks. So yeah, they play well together. So it just works. And then I stamped the sentiment over that with VersaFine Clair Nocturne ink. So now everything's stamped. Now I can adhere my little pattern paper strips. So adhere that with some craft tacky glue, flip over the card base, trim off the little bit that's hanging over. And then I can adhere the card front also with craft tacky glue and just kind of doing everything at once, you know, keeping everything together. So I know, you know, what card front goes with what card base, etc. So got that adhered. And then with the second card front, I'm going to adhere that strip of pattern paper just along the bottom because that was left over from cutting the piece for the card front. So adhered that into place, same thing, flipped it over, trimmed off the excess with my scissors, and then I can adhere the card front with that craft tacky glue as well. And then that'll technically finish off card number 2, but of course I'm going to add a little bit of bling. So adhere that into place. And then for the final card, I am going to just adhere that card front to the card base. And yeah, it'll cover the entire card base. Could have trimmed it down too. That would have looked fine, but either way, it just works. So got those adhered into place. You could finish here. Like, you know, everything looks great, but you guys know, I gotta add some bling. So I kept the bling subtle though. I just used some Trinity Stamps matte metallic gold confetti and just kind of sprinkled those onto each of these cards. So just a few here and there. And then I just picked them up with my little embellishment wand and adhered them into place with little dabs of craft tacky glue. And that's it. Simple, really. You'd think though that an entire tornado went through my craft room during the process. You guys only see it a little bit, you know, of the filming area, but it was chaos. Anywho, like always, I will have, or like I mentioned in the intro, I will have a link to the black, gold, and white playlist at the end of this video. I will also have a link to the unboxing video and the cards I made, the first cards I made using the kit. That'll be at the end as well. And then in the description box below the video, I will link to my blog post. In the blog post, it's the pictures and picture links to everything, etc. And then there'll be the supply list. All of that will be in the description box below the video. So if you want to check that out, you can just expand it and it's all there. As always, thank you all so very much for taking the time to watch my videos. I very much appreciate it. For thumbs upping and commenting, that definitely helps because, like I always joke, but it's literally true. It tells the robot overlords you guys like what you see, aka the algorithm. you know? So I always appreciate it. Subscribe if you haven't. I would love to have you. And stay tuned. I have tons of videos coming, as always. So I will see you all very soon in the next one. Bye.